Before Rome, before Greece, there was Egypt, a kingdom of god-kings, giant pyramids and secrets buried beneath the sand. Watch till the end, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Chapter 1. Before the Pharaohs. Before the pyramids rose above the desert. Before kings carved their names into stone. Before Egypt became one of the greatest civilizations in human history. There was only the river, the Nile. It cut through the harsh wilderness like a living vein, bringing life into a world surrounded by death. Beyond its waters stretched endless desert, silent, brutal, unforgiving. But along the banks of the Nile, the impossible became possible. Crops grew, animals gathered, villages appeared. And with them, civilization began. Each year, the river flooded the land with remarkable precision. Dark, fertile soil spread across the valley, transforming barren ground into fields capable of feeding entire communities. To the people who lived there, the Nile was not simply water. It was survival. It shaped everything: movement, farming, trade, belief. Villages rose close to its banks because distance from the river meant danger. The desert offered protection from invasion, but it also trapped the population within a narrow strip of life between sand and water. This isolation would shape Egypt differently from every civilization around it. While other regions struggled with constant migration and invasion, Egypt developed slowly, steadily, almost in isolation. Communities learned to cooperate with the rhythm of the river. Seasons became predictable. Agriculture became reliable. And reliable food changes human history. When people no longer fight daily for survival, they begin to build. Villages expanded into towns. Labor became specialized. Some farmed while others crafted tools, built boats, or traded resources along the river. Wealth began to accumulate. And wherever wealth gathers, power follows. In the earliest periods, Egypt was not a single kingdom. It was divided into small territories ruled by local leaders. These regions competed for land, water access, and influence. Over time, stronger rulers absorbed weaker ones, creating larger and more organized territories. Two major regions eventually emerged: Upper Egypt in the south, Lower Egypt in the north. Though connected by the Nile, they were politically separate, each with its own traditions, symbols, and rulers. Tension between them grew as ambition expanded. Control of the Nile meant control of trade, agriculture, and survival itself. The struggle for unification became inevitable. At the center of this transformation emerged powerful rulers who understood something others did not. A divided Egypt could survive, but a united Egypt could dominate. Among these rulers, one figure would later stand at the beginning of Egyptian history itself: Narmer. His rise marked more than military victory. It marked the birth of a state powerful enough to organize labor, command armies, and control resources on a scale never before seen along the Nile. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt changed everything. For the first time, the Nile Valley operated under centralized authority. Symbols of kingship merged. Administration expanded. Trade routes became more secure. Resources could now be directed toward projects far beyond the capabilities of scattered villages. Egypt was becoming something larger than a collection of settlements. It was becoming a kingdom. And with kingship came ideology. The ruler was no longer viewed merely as a political leader. The king became sacred, a figure tied directly to divine order. Maintaining stability along the Nile was seen not only as governance, but as a cosmic responsibility. This belief would become one of the foundations of Egyptian civilization. Because in Egypt, religion and power were never separate. They were the same structure. The king stood between gods and humanity, responsible for preserving balance in the world. Floods, harvests, prosperity, all became connected to the authority of the ruler. This gave Egyptian kings a level of legitimacy unlike anything seen before. And legitimacy creates endurance. As generations passed, Egypt grew more organized. Writing systems emerged to record goods, labor, and religious rituals. Temples became centers of administration and belief. Stone construction began replacing temporary structures, signaling a civilization no longer thinking only about survival. But permanence, that desire for permanence, would define Egypt more than anything else. The people of the Nile built not for decades, but for eternity. Tombs became monuments. Rituals became traditions repeated for centuries. Stability became sacred. While other civilizations rose and collapsed in chaos, Egypt sought continuity, order, balance. The foundations laid during these early centuries would support one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. A civilization that would build colossal monuments, command immense wealth, and inspire awe thousands of years later. But greatness does not emerge instantly. It is built slowly, through rivers, through labor, through belief. And Egypt was only beginning. The kingdom born along the Nile would soon enter an age of extraordinary power, where rulers would no longer be remembered merely as kings, but as pharaohs. Chapter 2. Rise of the Pharaohs. The unification of Egypt changed the course of history. What had once been scattered territories along the Nile became a single kingdom under centralized rule. For the first time, resources, labor, and authority flowed toward one center. The river that had connected villages now connected a civilization. And at the center of that civilization stood the pharaoh. Not simply a king, something greater. In Egypt, rulership evolved into a sacred institution, unlike anything the ancient world had yet seen. The pharaoh was believed to exist between humanity and the divine, responsible for maintaining balance throughout the land. Order, prosperity, even the flooding of the Nile itself became tied to the ruler's authority. This belief gave Egypt extraordinary stability, because obedience was no longer just political. It was spiritual. The early pharaohs understood the power of this idea. They expanded administration, strengthened control over agriculture, and organized labor on a scale previously impossible. Villages became provinces. Officials were appointed to oversee taxation, farming, construction, and trade. The kingdom grew more structured with each generation. The Nile remained its lifeline. Every harvest depended upon its predictable flooding, and controlling the river's resources became one of the pharaoh's greatest responsibilities. Grain storage systems expanded, ensuring survival during difficult years. Trade routes stretched deeper into neighboring regions, bringing gold, timber, incense, and precious materials into Egypt. Wealth accumulated rapidly, and wealth creates ambition. As the authority of the pharaoh increased, rulers began searching for ways to demonstrate their power, not only to their people, but to eternity itself. Temporary monuments were no longer enough. Egypt began building in stone. At first, these structures were modest compared to what would later emerge. Tombs known as mastabas appeared across the landscape, designed to preserve the dead and protect them for the afterlife. But within these constructions lay the beginning of something far greater. Because Egyptian civilization was becoming obsessed with permanence. Death to the Egyptians was not an ending. It was continuation. The soul required preparation, ritual, and preservation in order to survive beyond mortal life. This belief transformed burial practices into massive state projects. Pharaohs invested enormous resources into ensuring their passage into eternity. And through this obsession with the afterlife, architecture evolved. One ruler in particular would change Egyptian history forever. Djoser. Under his reign, A brilliant architect named Imhotep designed something the world had never seen before, a monumental stone structure rising toward the sky in layers. The Step Pyramid. It towered above the desert like a staircase toward the heavens, symbolizing both divine authority and eternal kingship. More importantly, it proved that Egypt possessed the organization, labor force, and engineering ability to create structures on an unimaginable scale. The Step Pyramid was not simply a tomb. It was a declaration. Egypt had entered a new age. As generations passed, the ambitions of the pharaohs grew even greater. Each ruler sought to surpass the last, not only in life, but in memory. Monumental construction became central to royal authority. Thousands of laborers, craftsmen, and engineers worked under state organization to create projects that would survive for eternity. This era became known as the Old Kingdom, an age of extraordinary confidence. Egypt's government operated with remarkable efficiency. Officials managed vast agricultural systems while scribes recorded taxes, supplies, and labor. Trade expanded across deserts and seas. The kingdom's wealth funded increasingly ambitious projects. And among those projects stood the greatest monuments Egypt would ever build. The Pyramids of Giza. Under Pharaoh Khufu, construction began on the largest pyramid the world had ever seen. Massive stone blocks were transported, shaped, and stacked with astonishing precision. Tens of thousands of workers labored under the burning sun, driven by organization, religious devotion, and royal authority. The result was staggering, a monument so immense that it seemed impossible even to those who built it. The Great Pyramid became more than a tomb. It became a symbol of Egypt itself. Powerful, eternal, unshakable. The pharaohs who followed continued this tradition, building colossal structures that reinforced the idea that Egypt existed under divine protection. Temples expanded, priests gained influence, religion became woven deeper into every aspect of life. But beneath this golden age, cracks slowly began to form. The construction of massive monuments required enormous resources. Wealth became concentrated around the royal court and temples. Provincial governors, entrusted with managing distant regions, began gaining influence of their own. Over time, central authority weakened. And when authority weakens, stability follows. The Nile, so predictable for generations, became less reliable during certain years. Poor floods reduced harvests. Hunger spread through regions already struggling with growing inequality. Local leaders became increasingly independent as confidence in the pharaoh declined. The divine image of kingship began to falter. Egypt had achieved greatness unlike any civilization before it. But greatness carries weight, and even the strongest kingdoms can be brought to the edge when the balance that sustains them begins to fail. The age of pyramid builders would not last forever. Darkness was approaching along the Nile, and Egypt was about to learn that even civilizations built for eternity can fracture. Chapter 3. The Age of Pyramids. The pyramids did not appear suddenly. They were the result of centuries of ambition, organization, belief, and power concentrated into stone. To later generations, they would seem almost impossible, structures so massive that they appeared beyond the capability of the ancient world. But to the Egyptians, they served a clear purpose. They were monuments to eternity. During the height of the Old Kingdom, Egypt experienced extraordinary stability. The pharaoh stood at the center of society, commanding resources from across the Nile Valley. Agriculture flourished under predictable floods, trade routes expanded, and the kingdom possessed a level of organization unmatched by most civilizations of its time. This stability allowed Egypt to attempt what no society had attempted before: construction on an unimaginable scale. The origins of pyramid building began with experimentation. Earlier rulers had been buried in mastabas, flat-roofed tombs built from mud brick and stone. Over time, these structures grew larger and more elaborate, reflecting the increasing authority of the pharaoh. Then came Djoser. Under his reign, the architect Imhotep transformed the traditional mastaba into something revolutionary. By stacking successive layers of stone upward, he created the step pyramid at Saqqara, the first monumental pyramid in history. It changed everything. The structure dominated the landscape, visible across the desert for miles. It was not only a royal tomb but a demonstration of state power, engineering skill, and religious devotion. More importantly, it proved that Egypt possessed the ability to organize labor and resources on a scale never before seen. The pharaohs who followed took this idea further. Each ruler sought to leave behind a monument greater than the last. Pyramid construction evolved rapidly as architects refined techniques, corrected flaws, and expanded ambitions. Early attempts collapsed or developed structural weaknesses, but failure only pushed Egyptian builders toward greater precision. Eventually, they achieved perfection. At Giza, along the western bank of the Nile, Egypt entered the peak of pyramid construction. Under Pharaoh Khufu, work began on the largest pyramid ever built. Massive limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, were transported across the desert with astonishing coordination. Thousands of laborers worked in organized teams. Contrary to later myths, these were not endless masses of slaves driven blindly through chaos. They were skilled workers, builders, engineers, craftsmen, and laborers supported by a vast administrative system. Entire communities existed to sustain construction, providing food, tools, transportation, and planning. The pyramids were not simply built through strength. They were built through organization. This revealed the true power of Egypt. Not merely military dominance, but control over labor, resources, and belief itself. The Great Pyramid rose higher with each passing year, its smooth white casing stones reflecting sunlight across the desert. To those who witnessed it, the structure must have appeared supernatural, an artificial mountain rising from the sands. And in many ways, that was the intention. The pyramid symbolized the pharaoh's connection to the divine. Its shape represented ascension toward the heavens, where the ruler would join the gods after death. Every chamber, passageway, and ritual associated with the structure reflected Egypt's obsession with the afterlife. Death was not feared in the same way as in other civilizations. It was prepared for. The pharaoh's tomb became a gateway into eternity, filled with treasures, statues, inscriptions, and offerings meant to sustain the ruler forever. Religion, architecture, and royal authority fused into a single purpose: immortality. Khufu's successors continued this tradition. Khafre constructed another colossal pyramid beside his father's monument, along with the Great Sphinx, a massive stone guardian carved with the face of a king. Menkaure followed with a smaller but still magnificent pyramid, completing the monumental complex that would define Egypt for thousands of years. Together, these structures became symbols of ultimate power. Yet behind their grandeur lay enormous cost. Pyramid construction demanded immense amounts of labor, food, stone, and wealth. The state's resources increasingly revolved around sustaining these projects. Temples expanded alongside royal tombs, and the priesthood gained growing influence as religion became even more central to society. For generations, Egypt maintained the balance required to support this system. But balance can be fragile. The larger the monuments became, the more resources they consumed. Provincial governors, responsible for managing distant territories, gained influence as the central government relied upon them more heavily. Wealth became concentrated among elites tied to the royal court and temple system. Meanwhile, the Nile itself, the foundation of Egyptian life, became less predictable during certain periods. Poor floods reduced harvests. Food shortages emerged. And when food becomes uncertain, stability begins to weaken. The divine image of the pharaoh depended upon prosperity. The ruler was expected to maintain harmony between humanity, nature, and the gods, but hunger and hardship created doubt. If the pharaoh truly held divine favor, why was the land suffering? Questions like these slowly eroded confidence in central authority. Local leaders began acting with greater independence. Regional power increased while royal control weakened. The age of pyramid building had represented the peak of Old Kingdom Egypt, a civilization so confident in its permanence that it attempted to build eternity itself in stone. But even stone cannot stop time. The great pyramids would endure. The rulers who built them would not. And as the authority of the pharaoh weakened, Egypt approached a period unlike anything it had known before. An age not of unity, but fragmentation. Chapter 4. Egypt falls into darkness. For centuries, Egypt had appeared eternal. The Nile flooded with dependable rhythm. The pharaoh ruled with divine authority. Massive monuments rose from the desert as symbols of stability and power. To the people of the kingdom, the world itself seemed ordered by forces that would never change. But civilizations rarely collapse without warning. The signs had already begun to appear beneath the surface of the Old Kingdom. Resources were stretched thin by monumental construction. Regional governors had gained increasing authority. Wealth and influence concentrated around powerful elites and temple institutions. The central government, once unquestioned, had begun to weaken. Then the Nile changed. The river that had sustained Egypt for generations became unpredictable during periods of low flooding. Fields that once produced abundance yielded poor harvests. Grain reserves diminished. Hunger spread across regions dependent upon agricultural stability. And when hunger enters a civilization, order begins to disappear. The divine image of the pharaoh depended entirely upon prosperity. The ruler was believed to maintain balance between the gods, nature, and humanity. But famine created doubt. If the pharaoh truly possessed divine authority, why was the land suffering? For the first time in generations, faith in the crown weakened. Provincial governors, already powerful from years of regional administration, began acting independently. Instead of relying upon the royal court, local rulers strengthened their own territories, built private armies, and secured resources for themselves. Egypt slowly fractured. Authority that once flowed from a single center along the Nile now scattered across competing regions. Communication weakened. Trade declined. Rivalries intensified between local powers seeking survival in an increasingly unstable kingdom. This period would later be remembered as the First Intermediate Period. An age of uncertainty. An age of division. An age where the illusion of eternal stability collapsed. Without strong central control, violence became more common. Tombs were looted, monuments neglected. Labor systems that had once organized massive projects fell apart. Many of the grand structures built during the Old Kingdom were abandoned to the desert winds. The silence surrounding the pyramids grew heavier. The kingdom that had once built mountains of stone could no longer maintain unity. Yet even in decline, Egypt did not disappear entirely. Local rulers adapted to the changing world. Some regions remained prosperous while others suffered deeply. Trade continued in limited forms. Communities survived along the Nile, holding onto traditions that had defined Egyptian civilization for centuries. But survival is not the same as greatness. The idea of Egypt as a unified kingdom had been broken. And once unity breaks, rebuilding it becomes difficult. Competing rulers emerged across Upper and Lower Egypt, each claiming legitimacy. Small wars erupted between regional powers seeking dominance over the Nile Valley. Alliances formed and dissolved rapidly as local leaders fought for territory, resources, and influence. The land that had once stood united under divine kingship became fragmented by ambition. At the same time, the priesthood grew increasingly influential. Temples controlled wealth, land, and labor independent of royal authority. Religion remained central to Egyptian life, but now spiritual power existed alongside political fragmentation. The balance that once defined Egypt had vanished, and in its absence came instability. Yet history rarely moves in a straight line. Periods of collapse often create the conditions for renewal. In the south, rulers from Thebes gradually expanded their influence. Unlike many local governors focused only on survival, these leaders carried a larger ambition. They sought reunification. They understood something essential. Egypt's strength had always come from unity along the Nile. Without it, the kingdom would remain vulnerable, divided, and weak. Among these rulers emerged Mentuhotep. His campaigns against rival territories slowly restored central authority. Through war, diplomacy, and persistence, he pushed northward, bringing fractured regions back under one crown. The process was neither quick nor peaceful, but it succeeded. After generations of division, Egypt became united once more. The darkness had not destroyed the civilization. It had tested it. The collapse of the Old Kingdom revealed the fragility hidden beneath Egypt's monumental confidence. The pyramids still stood above the desert, but now they served as reminders of both greatness and decline. Because even the mightiest civilizations can weaken when balance disappears. Yet Egypt's survival through this period proved something equally important. The civilization along the Nile possessed extraordinary resilience. It could fracture and still return. A new era was beginning, one shaped not only by power and faith, but by the memory of collapse itself. Chapter 5. The Middle Kingdom. Civilizations that survive collapse are never the same afterward. The Egypt that emerged from the years of division carried the memory of chaos within it. The fall of the Old Kingdom had shattered the illusion that stability was guaranteed forever. Rulers now understood that power could weaken, authority could fracture, and even divine kingship could be questioned. That knowledge changed Egypt. When Mentuhotep reunified the kingdom from Thebes, he did more than restore political order. He rebuilt the idea of Egypt itself. The Nile Valley, once divided between competing rulers, again stood under a single crown. Trade routes reopened. Agriculture stabilized. Temples regained structure. Administration returned. But this was not a return to the old world. It was the beginning of something more cautious, more disciplined, more aware of fragility. This era would become known as the Middle Kingdom, a period many historians would later view as one of Egypt's greatest ages of balance and refinement. The pharaoh remained the center of authority, but the rulers of the Middle Kingdom governed differently from the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom. They focused less on overwhelming monumentality and more on administration, organization, and strengthening internal control. The mistakes of the past had not been forgotten. Provincial governors, once powerful enough to challenge the throne, were now watched more carefully. Royal authority extended deeper into regional administration. The state rebuilt systems of taxation, labor management, and food storage with greater precision. Control became more centralized, and with centralized control came renewed prosperity. The Nile once again provided stable harvests. Grain production increased. Trade expanded south into Nubia and east toward the Levant. Gold, ivory, timber, incense, and precious materials flowed into Egypt through carefully protected routes. The kingdom grew wealthy once more. Yet the rulers of this age understood that wealth alone could not secure stability. The people themselves had to believe in the restoration of order. This idea became central to Middle Kingdom Egypt. Literature, art, and religion increasingly emphasized harmony, justice, and balance. The pharaoh was presented not merely as a divine ruler, but as a protector responsible for preserving stability throughout the land. Order became sacred again. But this time, it carried the memory of what happened when order failed. Construction projects returned, though with less obsession over gigantic pyramids. Temples expanded across the Nile Valley, serving not only religious purposes but also administrative and economic functions. Fortresses were built along Egypt's southern borders to protect trade routes and secure territory. The kingdom had learned to think strategically. Particularly important was Egypt's relationship with Nubia. To the south lay immense resources, especially gold, which became one of the foundations of Egypt's renewed power. Pharaohs expanded military presence in these regions, establishing forts and exerting stronger influence over trade networks. Egypt was no longer simply defending itself. It was extending its reach. At the same time, art and culture flourished. Egyptian sculpture became more realistic and expressive. Literature evolved beyond royal inscriptions into stories, wisdom texts, and reflections on society itself. Scribes gained growing importance as literacy became central to administration. Knowledge became power, and Egypt possessed both. Yet beneath this renewed stability, pressure slowly gathered once again. The Middle Kingdom depended heavily upon strong leadership and centralized control. As long as capable rulers maintained authority, the system functioned effectively. But over time, weaker pharaohs began to emerge. Court politics became increasingly complex. Regional elites regained influence. The structure remained stable, but less secure. Meanwhile, beyond Egypt's borders, populations in neighboring regions were shifting. Groups from Western Asia gradually moved closer to the Nile Delta, sometimes peacefully through trade and settlement, other times through migration driven by instability elsewhere. At first, these movements seemed manageable. Egypt had dealt with foreigners before, but this time would be different. As central authority weakened during the later Middle Kingdom, Egypt became increasingly vulnerable to outside influence. The Delta region in the north, distant from the royal center in Thebes, became difficult to control completely. And where control weakens, opportunity appears. Foreign rulers known as the Hyksos gradually established dominance over parts of Lower Egypt. They brought with them new technologies, including horse-drawn chariots and advanced weapons unfamiliar to many Egyptian armies. For the second time in its history, Egypt began losing unity. The kingdom that had recovered from internal collapse now faced something even more dangerous: foreign rule. The age of balance was ending, and Egypt was about to enter one of the most transformative struggles in its history, a struggle that would reshape its military, its rulers, and its future forever. Chapter 6. The Hyksos and the Warrior Pharaohs. Egypt had endured famine, rebellion, and division, but foreign rulers controlling the Nile. That was something entirely different. For generations, Egypt had viewed itself as the center of order in a chaotic world. The deserts protected it. The Nile sustained it. Even during periods of collapse, Egyptian rulers had always fought other Egyptians for control of the land. Now, outsiders ruled part of the kingdom. The Hyksos did not arrive through a single overwhelming invasion. Their rise was slower, shaped by migration, trade, and gradual settlement in the Nile Delta during the weakening years of the Middle Kingdom. As central authority declined, These foreign groups expanded their influence until they eventually seized control over northern Egypt. And once they gained power, they stayed. From their capital at Avaris in the Delta, the Hyksos established themselves as rulers over Lower Egypt. They adopted aspects of Egyptian culture, used Egyptian titles, and governed much like pharaohs themselves. But to many Egyptians, they remained outsiders, a symbol of humiliation, a reminder that the kingdom was no longer united. The Hyksos possessed advantages Egypt had not fully encountered before. They introduced military technologies that transformed warfare across the region: horse-drawn chariots, composite bows, and more advanced bronze weapons. Against fragmented Egyptian forces, these innovations proved devastating. The old systems of defense were no longer enough. For nearly a century, Egypt remained divided between Hyksos-controlled territories in the north and native Egyptian rulers in the south, centered around Thebes. Tension between the two powers steadily grew. The rulers of Thebes tolerated Hyksos dominance only because they lacked the strength to challenge it directly. But patience slowly turned into determination. The Theban rulers understood something essential: Egypt could never fully recover while divided under foreign control. And so preparations began. Unlike earlier pharaohs who had relied largely upon the natural protection of geography, the southern rulers transformed Egypt into a militarized state. They studied Hyksos warfare carefully, adopting the very technologies once used against them. Egypt learned, adapted, evolved. The horse-drawn chariot became central to Egyptian military strategy. Archery improved. Armies became more disciplined and mobile than ever before. What had once been a kingdom protected by isolation was becoming a kingdom prepared for war. The struggle for liberation began under Seqenenre, a ruler from Thebes who openly challenged Hyksos authority. Conflict intensified, and according to later evidence, Seqenenre likely died violently in battle, his skull bearing severe wounds. His death did not end the resistance. It strengthened it. His successors continued the war with increasing aggression. Camels launched campaigns northward, attacking Hyksos territory and attempting to cut their control over trade and communication routes. Then came Ahmose. Under his leadership, Egypt's military transformation reached its peak. Ahmose organized sustained campaigns against the Hyksos strongholds in the Delta, pushing steadily northward with disciplined armies equipped for a new era of warfare. The final battles were brutal. Cities fell, fortresses burned, and eventually the Hyksos were driven from Egypt entirely. For the first time in generations, the Nile was united again under native Egyptian rule. But Egypt had changed forever. The struggle against the Hyksos reshaped the kingdom's identity. The rulers who emerged from this conflict were no longer simply divine caretakers of balance and ritual. They were warrior kings. The memory of foreign occupation left deep scars within Egyptian society. Isolation no longer felt like enough protection. The pharaohs understood that enemies beyond their borders could threaten the kingdom directly. And so Egypt adopted a new strategy: expansion. Rather than waiting for threats to approach the Nile, Egypt would push outward into neighboring regions, securing territory and creating buffers against future invasions. This marked the beginning of the New Kingdom, the most powerful age in Egyptian history. Military campaigns expanded into Nubia and the Levant. Wealth poured into Egypt through conquest, tribute, and trade. The army became a permanent institution central to royal authority. The pharaoh was no longer only a sacred ruler tied to the gods. He became conqueror, commander, protector of empire. Temples grew larger than ever before, funded by military success and foreign wealth. Cities expanded. Gold flowed from Nubia. Captives, resources, and tribute strengthened the kingdom's economy. Egypt had emerged from humiliation stronger, harder, and more ambitious. The Hyksos had nearly broken the kingdom. Instead, they transformed it into an empire. And now, with armies marching beyond the Nile and warrior pharaohs rising to power, Egypt stood ready to dominate the ancient world in a way it never had before. Its greatest age was about to begin. Chapter 7. Egypt becomes an empire. The Egypt that emerged after the Hyksos Wars was no longer the isolated kingdom of the pyramid builders. It had changed. The memory of foreign occupation had transformed the pharaohs into military rulers who understood that survival required strength beyond the Nile Valley itself. Egypt could no longer depend solely on deserts and rivers for protection. Enemies had crossed those barriers once before. They could do it again. So the rulers of the new kingdom adopted a new vision. Egypt would not wait for threats to arrive. Egypt would expand. Under Ahmose, the foundations of this new age were established. The Hyksos were driven beyond the borders of the Delta, pursued into southern Canaan, where Egyptian armies destroyed remaining strongholds that might one day threaten the kingdom again. This was more than revenge. It was strategy. The pharaohs began creating buffer zones beyond Egypt's borders, extending influence into neighboring territories to prevent future invasions. Military campaigns moved south into Nubia and north into the Levant, securing trade routes and valuable resources. And with every victory, Egypt grew wealthier. Gold from Nubia flowed into royal treasuries. Timber from Lebanon arrived for construction projects. Tribute poured in from conquered regions: grain, livestock, precious metals, and captives. The kingdom transformed into an empire. At the center of this expansion stood a series of remarkable rulers who pushed Egypt further than ever before. Among them was Thutmose I, who carried military campaigns deep into foreign lands, demonstrating that Egyptian armies could project power far beyond the Nile. But it was under Thutmose III that Egypt reached extraordinary heights. Often called the greatest military pharaoh in Egyptian history, Thutmose III inherited a kingdom already growing in strength. Yet early in his reign, rebellion erupted among states in the Levant seeking freedom from Egyptian control. The response was swift. Thutmose marched north with disciplined armies hardened by generations of warfare. At Megiddo, he faced a coalition of enemy rulers gathered against Egypt. The campaign required careful planning, strategic movement, and bold decision-making. Thutmose chose the most dangerous route through narrow mountain passes, surprising enemy forces completely. The gamble worked. The Egyptian army struck with devastating force, crushing resistance and securing victory. The Battle of Megiddo became one of the earliest well-documented military campaigns in history and marked the beginning of Egypt's dominance across the eastern Mediterranean. Afterward, Thutmose launched repeated campaigns into Syria and Canaan, securing cities, demanding tribute, and establishing Egypt as the dominant power in the region. The empire expanded farther than ever before. Egyptian influence now stretched across vast territories connected by trade, military control, and political alliances. Foreign rulers sent tribute to the pharaoh. Diplomacy flourished alongside conquest. Wealth beyond imagination entered the kingdom. Temples rose higher. Palaces grew grander. And the pharaoh became more powerful than any ruler Egypt had known before. At Karnak, massive temple complexes expanded into monuments of imperial confidence. Colossal columns towered above sacred courtyards, while walls recorded military victories and divine favor. Religion and empire became inseparable. The gods themselves were seen as supporting Egypt's expansion. Nowhere was this clearer than in the growing power of the god Amun. The priesthood of Amun accumulated immense wealth through royal donations, temple lands, and tribute from conquered territories. Karnak became not only a spiritual center, but an economic and political force within the empire. As Egypt's wealth increased, so did its cultural influence. Foreign princes were brought to the royal court, raised within Egyptian traditions, and later returned to rule territories loyal to the pharaoh. Art, architecture, and language spread across regions connected to Egypt's growing empire. For a time, the kingdom appeared unstoppable. Its armies were feared, its rulers worshipped, its monuments eternal. Yet empires carry hidden dangers alongside their triumphs. The farther Egypt expanded, the more resources were required to maintain control. Garrisons had to be supplied, trade routes protected, rebellions suppressed, diplomacy managed carefully among rival powers emerging across the ancient Near East. And beyond Egypt's borders, other kingdoms were growing stronger as well. The Hittites in Anatolia expanded their influence. Kingdoms in Mesopotamia reorganized. Competition for territory and trade intensified across the region. The ancient world was changing. Egypt still stood at its center, but maintaining that position would require constant strength. The warrior pharaohs had built an empire through conquest and ambition. Now they would face the challenge every empire eventually encounters: how to hold power once the entire world begins fighting for it. Chapter 8. Hatshepsut, the woman who ruled Egypt. In a civilization ruled by kings, one woman rose high enough to become pharaoh. Not queen, not regent, pharaoh. And in doing so, Hatshepsut transformed the history of Egypt forever. Her rise was extraordinary not because women held no influence in Egypt. They often possessed considerable authority within royal courts, but because the throne itself was deeply tied to the image of male kingship. The pharaoh was seen not only as a ruler, but as the living embodiment of divine order, a sacred figure traditionally presented as male in both ritual and symbolism. Yet Hatshepsut would challenge that tradition and succeed. She was born into the royal family during the height of the New Kingdom, the daughter of Thutmose I, one of Egypt's great warrior pharaohs. Raised within the world of temples, administration, and military expansion, she understood power from an early age. When her husband, Thutmose II, died, the throne passed to the young Thutmose III, who was still a child. Initially, Hatshepsut ruled as regent, governing on behalf of the boy king. But over time, her authority expanded. What began as temporary stewardship gradually transformed into something unprecedented. Hatshepsut declared herself pharaoh, adopting the full titles and symbols of kingship. She appeared in royal imagery wearing traditional regalia, including the ceremonial false beard associated with Egyptian rulers. This was not an attempt to hide her identity. It was political necessity. To rule Egypt effectively, she needed to embody the institution of pharaoh itself. And she did. Surprisingly, her reign brought remarkable stability and prosperity. Rather than focusing primarily on military conquest, Hatshepsut emphasized economic growth, diplomacy, and monumental construction. Egypt remained powerful under her rule, but its strength was directed inward toward wealth, trade, and cultural expansion. One of her greatest achievements was the famous expedition to Punt. Far to the south and east, beyond the Red Sea, lay lands rich in exotic goods, incense, ebony, gold, ivory, rare animals, and precious woods. Hatshepsut organized a massive trading expedition that returned with extraordinary wealth and resources. The success of the mission reinforced her legitimacy. Egypt prospered under her leadership, and prosperity strengthens authority. At the same time, Hatshepsut launched some of the most ambitious building projects Egypt had seen in generations. Temples expanded across the Nile Valley, but none became more famous than her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. Built against towering cliffs on the western bank of the Nile, the structure appeared almost carved into the landscape itself. Terraces rose in perfect balance beneath the desert mountains, connected by ramps and lined with statues of the pharaoh. It was elegant, massive, and unlike anything Egypt had built before. The temple reflected Hatshepsut's rule itself, carefully designed, deliberate, and deeply symbolic. Inscriptions across its walls emphasized divine approval for her kingship, presenting her reign as part of cosmic order rather than political disruption. She understood something essential about power. Authority survives through narrative, and Hatshepsut controlled the narrative masterfully. For years, Egypt flourished under her reign. Trade expanded, wealth increased, construction projects employed thousands, temples received enormous donations. Stability returned to the kingdom without constant warfare. Yet beneath the surface, tension remained. Because no matter how successful her reign became, Hatshepsut's position challenged long-standing traditions of kingship. Some within the royal court likely viewed her authority as temporary or unnatural, even if they accepted it publicly. And time eventually changes every balance of power. As Thutmose III matured, his role within the kingdom expanded. Though overshadowed during Hatshepsut's reign, he remained the rightful heir according to traditional succession. When Hatshepsut died, the transition of power revealed how fragile legacy can become. Thutmose III assumed full control of Egypt. And over time, many images and inscriptions associated with Hatshepsut were removed, damaged, or erased. Her statues were destroyed. Her name disappeared from monuments. Later rulers attempted to reduce her visibility within royal history. Why this happened remains debated. Perhaps it was political, perhaps personal, or perhaps it reflected an effort to restore traditional ideas of kingship after a ruler who had disrupted them so completely. But despite these attempts, Hatshepsut could not truly be erased. Her monuments survived, her temple endured, and the scale of her accomplishments remained impossible to ignore. Centuries later, historians and archaeologists would rediscover her story hidden beneath damaged inscriptions and shattered statues. The woman who had once ruled as pharaoh emerged again from the sands of history, not as a footnote, but as one of Egypt's most remarkable rulers. Her reign proved that Egypt's strength did not depend solely upon conquest or war. Under Hatshepsut, the empire expanded through trade, wealth, and strategic leadership. She ruled during one of Egypt's greatest ages of prosperity. And though later generations tried to silence her memory, stone remembers. The cliffs of Deir el-Bahari still rise above the Nile, and through them Hatshepsut still speaks. Chapter 9. Akhenaten and the Sun God. Empires are built on tradition, and few civilizations depended on tradition more than Egypt. For centuries, the kingdom along the Nile had remained stable because every part of society was connected to sacred order. The pharaoh ruled by divine authority. The temples controlled immense wealth and influence. Priests maintained rituals believed to preserve balance between humanity and the gods. Religion was not separate from the state. It was the state. Generations of Egyptians worshipped a vast pantheon of gods tied to nature, kingship, death, fertility, and the cosmos itself. Among them, none had risen higher during the New Kingdom than Amun, whose priests at Karnak possessed extraordinary power. Their temples controlled land, labor, wealth, and political influence rivaling even the pharaoh. And then came Akhenaten. His reign would become one of the most mysterious and controversial periods in Egyptian history, not because of military conquest or political collapse, but because he attempted something almost unimaginable. He tried to change the soul of Egypt itself. Born as Amenhotep IV, he inherited one of the wealthiest and most powerful kingdoms of the ancient world. Egypt's empire stretched across foreign territories. Gold flowed from Nubia. Trade connected the Nile to distant lands. The kingdom appeared stable, but Akhenaten saw danger in the growing power of the priesthood, especially the priests of Amen. Their influence had become immense, deeply embedded within every level of society. And perhaps he believed no ruler should share power with the god's servants. Or perhaps he truly believed in something different. Early in his reign, Amenhotep IV began elevating the worship of Aten, the sun disk, above all other gods. At first, this shift seemed gradual, but over time it became revolutionary. The pharaoh changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for Aten. And then the transformation accelerated. Temples dedicated to traditional gods were closed or neglected. The names of Amen and other deities were removed from monuments. Religious practices that had defined Egypt for centuries were suddenly challenged by royal decree. Akhenaten declared Aten not merely supreme, but singular. For what may have been the first time in recorded history, a ruler attempted to move an entire civilization towards something resembling monotheism. The implications were enormous. Egypt's traditional religious system was deeply tied to political and economic power. The temples employed thousands, controlled massive estates, and formed the backbone of regional authority. Weakening them altered the structure of the kingdom itself. Akhenaten understood this, and he moved even further. He abandoned the old centers of power entirely and ordered the construction of a new capital city deep in the desert. Akhetaten, known today as Amarna. The city rose rapidly under royal command, filled with open-air temples dedicated to the sunlight of Aten. Unlike traditional Egyptian temples hidden in darkness and mystery, these structures embraced openness, reflecting Akhenaten's vision of divine light reaching directly from the sun. Even Egyptian art changed dramatically during his reign. For centuries, royal imagery had followed strict idealized forms. Pharaohs appeared timeless, powerful, and perfect. Under Akhenaten, artistic styles became strangely naturalistic and deeply unusual. The royal family was depicted with elongated features, intimate family scenes, and emotional expressions rarely seen in earlier Egyptian art. It was as though the entire civilization had shifted into another reality. A new religion, a new capital, a new artistic identity, a new Egypt. But revolutions create enemies. Many within the kingdom likely viewed Akhenaten's changes with confusion, resentment, or fear. The old gods had protected Egypt for generations. The priesthood still possessed enormous hidden influence. And while the pharaoh focused intensely on religious transformation, Egypt's foreign empire began weakening. Beyond the Nile, rival powers expanded their influence while Egyptian control over distant territories weakened. Letters from foreign rulers requesting military aid went unanswered or delayed. The empire built by warrior pharaohs slowly began to fracture at its edges. Akhenaten appeared consumed by spiritual vision, while political realities grew more dangerous. And then, his reign ended. The exact circumstances remain uncertain, buried beneath incomplete records and damaged monuments. But after his death, the reaction was swift. The old order returned. Traditional gods were restored. Aten's dominance collapsed. Akhetaten was abandoned to the desert. Later rulers dismantled Akhenaten's monuments, erased his name from records, and attempted to remove him entirely from Egyptian history. It was as though Egypt itself rejected the memory of his revolution. Even Tutankhamun, the young pharaoh who followed, changed his name away from Aten worship to honor Amun once again. The experiment had failed, or so it seemed. Yet Akhenaten's reign remains unforgettable precisely because it was so radical. In a civilization built upon continuity, he attempted transformation. In a kingdom devoted to ancient tradition, he challenged the foundations of belief itself. And though later rulers tried to erase him, history remembered. The ruined city of Amarna still lies beneath the desert sun. Fragments of his statues survive. His story endures as one of the most extraordinary moments in Egyptian history. A moment when a pharaoh looked upon thousands of years of tradition and tried to replace eternity itself. Chapter 10. Ramses II the Great. Some rulers inherit powerful kingdoms. Others become legends. Ramses II became both. By the time he ascended the throne, Egypt had already endured centuries of transformation. The warrior pharaohs had built an empire stretching beyond the Nile. Great temples covered the land. Wealth flowed into royal treasuries from conquest, trade, and tribute. But maintaining an empire is far more difficult than creating one. Beyond Egypt's borders, rival powers had risen. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia challenged Egyptian influence across Syria and the Levant. Smaller kingdoms shifted alliances constantly, balancing between two great powers competing for dominance. The ancient world had entered an age of empires, and Ramses II intended for Egypt to stand above them all. He came to power young, energetic, and ambitious. Almost immediately, he began presenting himself as the embodiment of royal strength. Monumental statues, inscriptions, and temples spread across the kingdom, each reinforcing the image of an unstoppable ruler chosen by the gods themselves. But Ramses II understood something essential about power. It must be seen, and no pharaoh mastered political image better than he did. Massive monuments rose under his command. Temples expanded across Egypt and Nubia. His likeness appeared everywhere, towering statues carved into cliffs, colossal seated figures guarding entrances, reliefs depicting victories and divine favor. To later generations, it would seem as though Ramses II ruled forever. In reality, his reign lasted more than 60 years, an extraordinary length in the ancient world. Entire generations lived and died knowing no other pharaoh. That longevity alone strengthened his legend. Yet Ramses II sought more than memory. He sought glory through conquest. The greatest challenge came at Kadesh, a strategic city in Syria contested between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. Control of the region meant influence over trade routes, military access, and political dominance throughout the Near East. Ramses II marched north, with one of the largest armies Egypt had ever assembled. The campaign began confidently. Too confidently. Hittite spies deliberately misled the Egyptians, convincing Ramses II that the enemy remained far away. Believing victory near, he advanced ahead of much of his army. It was a trap. The Hittites struck suddenly with thousands of chariots, crashing into the Egyptian forces before they fully organized. Chaos erupted across the battlefield. Egyptian divisions scattered as enemy chariots tore through the camp. For a moment, disaster seemed inevitable. According to royal inscriptions, Ramses II himself rallied the army during the crisis, charging directly into battle and restoring order through personal bravery. Egyptian records portray him as nearly superhuman, standing alone against overwhelming enemies while the gods granted him strength. The truth was likely more complex. But what matters historically is this: Egypt survived. The battle ended without decisive victory for either side, though Ramses II presented it as a triumphant success throughout Egypt. Massive relief carvings showed him crushing enemies beneath his chariot, while inscriptions praised his unmatched courage. Again, Ramses II understood power through image. perception mattered as much as reality. Despite the uncertain military outcome, the conflict eventually led to something remarkable, the first known peace treaty between major powers in recorded history. Egypt and the Hittites recognized that endless warfare benefited neither empire. Diplomacy replaced constant battle. The treaty stabilized the region for years and demonstrated Egypt's continued importance within the ancient world. At home, Ramses II focused heavily on construction. Few rulers in history left behind so many monuments. At Abu Simbel, colossal statues of the pharaoh were carved directly into mountainsides, starring eternally across the Nile. Temples at Luxor and Karnak expanded further under his reign. Every structure reinforced the same message. Ramses II was eternal. Even his burial complex reflected unimaginable scale. The Ramesseum, his mortuary temple, stood as another symbol of royal grandeur designed to preserve his memory forever. And in many ways, it worked. Thousands of years later, his name remains among the most recognizable of all ancient rulers. Yet beneath the glory, Egypt's position was slowly changing. Maintaining vast construction projects required enormous resources. Foreign pressures increased as migrations and invasions destabilized parts of the eastern Mediterranean. The empire remained powerful under Ramses II, but signs of strain were beginning to appear. No ruler, no matter how great, can stop time. When Ramses II finally died after decades on the throne, Egypt lost more than a king. It lost stability tied to a single extraordinary ruler. The generations after him would struggle to maintain the same level of authority. Rivals gathered beyond Egypt's borders. Internal weaknesses grew harder to ignore. The golden age of the New Kingdom had reached its peak under Ramses II. And after the peak comes decline. Chapter 11. The collapse of the New Kingdom. Empires rarely fall in a single moment. They weaken slowly, one crisis at a time, one failed ruler after another, one lost battle, one broken system, one fading belief. By the end of Ramses II's reign, Egypt still appeared powerful to the outside world. Its temples towered above the Nile. Its monuments dominated the desert. Its armies remained feared across neighboring lands. But beneath the surface, the foundations of the new kingdom were beginning to crack. The empire built through conquest and expansion had become increasingly difficult to maintain. Foreign territories required constant military presence. Garrisons had to be supplied. Trade routes demanded protection. The enormous wealth flowing into Egypt during earlier centuries no longer arrived with the same consistency. At the same time, rival powers across the eastern Mediterranean were collapsing into chaos. Entire civilizations began to disappear. The reasons remain debated even thousands of years later. Climate instability, famine, migration, internal rebellion and warfare combined into a period of widespread destruction now known as the Bronze Age collapse. And Egypt stood directly in its path. Among the greatest threats were the mysterious groups later remembered as the Sea Peoples. Their origins remain uncertain, but their impact was devastating. These migrating warriors attacked cities, trade routes, and coastal kingdoms across the Mediterranean world. Empires that had stood for centuries fell before them. The Hittite Empire collapsed completely. Major cities burned. Trade networks shattered. The world around Egypt descended into instability. Under Ramses III, one of the last strong rulers of the New Kingdom, Egypt fought desperately to survive. Massive battles erupted both on land and sea as the Sea Peoples attempted to invade the Nile Delta itself. The conflict was brutal. Egyptian records describe enormous enemy fleets approaching the coast, while armies advanced toward the kingdom's borders. Ramses III organized defenses carefully, positioning archers and ships to trap the invaders as they entered narrow waterways. The strategy succeeded. Egypt survived the invasion. Reliefs carved into temple walls depict enemy ships overturned in chaos, while Egyptian forces strike from every direction. Ramses III celebrated the victory as proof of divine protection and royal strength. But survival came at enormous cost. The wars drained resources already stretched thin by decades of pressure. Trade systems across the Mediterranean remained shattered. Economic instability spread throughout Egypt. Grain shortages and inflation created growing hardship among ordinary people. For the first time in recorded history, workers in the royal necropolis went on strike because they had not received proper food payments. Even the systems supporting tomb construction and royal burial were failing. Corruption spread deeper into administration. Officials abused power for personal gain while central authority weakened. Tomb robbery became increasingly common, including theft from royal burial sites once believed untouchable. The illusion of eternal order was collapsing. At the same time, the priesthood of Amun accumulated extraordinary influence. The temples controlled vast amounts of land, wealth, and labor independent of the pharaoh. In Upper Egypt especially, high priests became political powers rivaling royal authority itself. The balance of the kingdom fractured again. Pharaohs still ruled in name, but real power was becoming divided. As weaker rulers followed Ramses III, Egypt's military influence abroad declined rapidly. Foreign territories were abandoned. Trade connections weakened. The empire that had once dominated the Near East retreated back toward the Nile itself. Egypt was no longer expanding. It was surviving. And survival creates a very different kind of kingdom. The later rulers of the new kingdom struggled against forces larger than any individual pharaoh could control. Economic decline, political fragmentation, foreign pressure, and internal corruption combined into a slow unraveling of imperial power. The monuments still stood. The temples still operated. But the confidence that had once defined Egypt was fading. Eventually, the new kingdom came to an end. Central authority weakened so severely that regional powers emerged once more. High priests controlled parts of Upper Egypt while rival dynasties claimed authority elsewhere. The age of empire was over. Yet Egypt itself endured. It always endured. Even after losing its foreign territories, even after political collapse, the civilization along the Nile survived through continuity of culture, religion, and identity. The kingdom weakened, fragmented, and changed, but it did not vanish. Not yet, because Egypt's story was far from finished. New rulers would rise. Foreign powers would arrive. And the ancient kingdom that once built pyramids and conquered empires would soon face an entirely new world, one where it was no longer the dominant power, but the prize others sought to control. Chapter 12. Foreign Kings on the Nile. Egypt had survived collapse before. It had endured famine, invasion, civil war, and the fall of dynasties. Each time, the kingdom adapted and rebuilt itself around the Nile. But after the end of the new kingdom, something fundamental had changed. Egypt was no longer the dominant power of the ancient world. The empire that once projected armies across foreign lands now struggled to maintain unity within its own borders. Regional rulers competed for influence, while priesthoods controlled enormous wealth and authority. Dynasties rose and fell rapidly, often lacking the strength or legitimacy of earlier pharaohs. The age of Egyptian supremacy was fading. And beyond the Nile, stronger powers were rising. The first major foreign rulers to dominate Egypt came from Nubia to the south. For centuries, Nubian kingdoms had lived under Egyptian influence, absorbing aspects of Egyptian religion, art, and kingship. But as Egypt weakened, the balance shifted. The Nubian kings moved northward, and eventually they conquered Egypt itself. These rulers of the Kushite kingdom did not attempt to destroy Egyptian civilization. Instead, they embraced it completely. They presented themselves as true pharaohs, restoring temples, reviving traditional religious practices, and honoring ancient customs that many Egyptians themselves feared were disappearing. In some ways, the Nubian rulers admired Egypt more deeply than the fragmented Egyptian dynasties they replaced. Under their rule, there was a brief revival of ancient traditions. Temples were repaired, monuments restored, the image of divine kingship strengthened again. But this resurgence would not last. Far to the east, another empire had begun expanding with terrifying speed. The Assyrians. Unlike many earlier powers, the Assyrians built their empire through relentless military force. Their armies were highly organized, disciplined, and brutally effective. Cities that resisted them were destroyed completely as warnings to others. When Assyria turned its attention toward Egypt, the aging kingdom struggled to resist. Campaigns swept through the Nile Delta. Battles devastated Egyptian forces. Eventually, Assyrian armies captured major cities, and for a time, Egypt fell under foreign domination once again. The psychological impact was enormous. The land that had once viewed itself as the center of civilization now stood vulnerable before outside empires stronger than itself. Yet Assyrian control proved difficult to maintain. Distance, rebellion, and instability weakened their hold over Egypt. Eventually, native Egyptian rulers regained partial independence during a final revival centered around the city of Sais. This period, often called the Late Period, represented Egypt's last attempt to restore its ancient greatness. The rulers looked backward for inspiration. They revived artistic styles from earlier dynasties. Religious traditions were strengthened again. Monuments celebrated connections to the glorious past of pyramid builders and warrior pharaohs. But the world around Egypt had changed permanently. Empires were growing larger than ever before, and one of them was approaching rapidly from the east. The Persians. Under Cambyses, son of Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire expanded into Egypt after decisive military victory. Once again, foreign rulers claimed the throne of the pharaohs. Yet the Persians, much like the Nubians before them, often governed through Egyptian traditions rather than destroying them outright. They respected temples, adopted royal titles, and integrated Egypt into a much larger imperial system stretching across vast territories. For the first time, Egypt became part of a truly global empire. The Nile was no longer the center of power. It was a province within something larger. Egyptian identity endured, but political independence weakened further. Revolts erupted periodically against Persian rule, showing that the desire for native kingship still remained powerful among the population. But resistance alone could not restore the past. Then from the west came another conqueror whose arrival would transform Egypt forever. Alexander. When Alexander the Great entered Egypt, he was welcomed by many as a liberator from Persian rule. Unlike invading armies before him, he encountered relatively little resistance. Egypt opened itself to him willingly, exhausted by cycles of foreign domination and political instability. Alexander understood the importance of Egypt immediately. He honored local traditions, visited sacred temples, and allowed himself to be presented as pharaoh. More importantly, he founded a city along the Mediterranean coast that would become one of the greatest centers of knowledge in human history. Alexandria. After Alexander's death, his generals divided his empire, and Egypt came under the control of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek ruling family that blended Hellenistic and Egyptian traditions together. The world of the pharaohs was changing once again. Greek language spread through administration and culture. Alexandria grew into a center of trade, science, and scholarship. The famous Library of Alexandria attracted thinkers from across the ancient world. Yet beneath these changes, Egypt remained Egypt. The temples still stood beside the Nile. The old gods were still worshipped. The pyramids still watched over the desert. Civilizations had risen and fallen around them. Foreign kings now ruled the land. But the memory of ancient Egypt refused to disappear. Even as new empires claimed the Nile, the shadow of the pharaohs remained. Chapter 13. Cleopatra and the End of Ancient Egypt. By the time Cleopatra was born, the age of the pharaohs was already fading into history. The pyramids were ancient even to her. The great warrior kings of the New Kingdom belonged to a distant past, remembered through monuments, temple walls, and fading legends. Egypt still possessed immense wealth and cultural prestige, but politically, it had become trapped between rising superpowers competing for control of the Mediterranean world. And among those powers, none was more dangerous than Rome. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, had ruled Egypt for centuries by blending Greek authority with Egyptian tradition. Alexandria had become one of the greatest cities in the world, a center of trade, philosophy, science, and learning. But beneath its brilliance lay instability. Court politics within the Ptolemaic dynasty were ruthless. Rival siblings competed for power through alliances, betrayal, and assassination. The kingdom's wealth attracted constant foreign interest, while internal divisions weakened royal authority. It was into this dangerous world that Cleopatra emerged. Unlike many rulers before her, Cleopatra understood that survival required more than inheritance. It required intelligence, strategy, and the ability to navigate the ambitions of powerful men. She became queen during a period of severe political tension. Rome, expanding rapidly across the Mediterranean, increasingly controlled the fate of neighboring kingdoms through military dominance and economic influence. Egypt remained wealthy, particularly because of its grain supply, but wealth alone could not guarantee independence. Cleopatra knew Egypt could not confront Rome through force, so she chose diplomacy and persuasion. One of her most famous alliances began with Julius Caesar. At the time, Rome itself was divided by civil war. Caesar arrived in Egypt pursuing his rival Pompey, only to become entangled in the kingdom's own succession conflict between Cleopatra and her brother. According to later accounts, Cleopatra arranged a secret meeting with Caesar by being smuggled into his presence concealed within fabric or bedding. Whether embellished or entirely true, the story reflects the image she cultivated carefully: bold, intelligent, and impossible to ignore. The alliance changed everything. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra secured the throne. Their relationship strengthened Egypt's position temporarily, while also tying its future directly to Rome's internal struggles. Cleopatra later bore Caesar a son, further linking the two powers together. But Rome was unstable, and power there changed violently. When Julius Caesar was assassinated in Rome, chaos erupted once again. Rival factions competed for control of the Republic, and Cleopatra faced a dangerous new reality. Egypt's survival depended upon aligning with whoever emerged victorious. This led her toward another powerful Roman figure, Mark Antony. Their alliance became one of the most famous relationships in ancient history. Together, Cleopatra and Antony envisioned a powerful Eastern empire capable of rivaling Rome itself. Their partnership combined military ambition, political strategy, and personal attachment. But in Rome, their enemies used the relationship as propaganda. Octavian, later known as Augustus, portrayed Antony as corrupted by an Eastern queen, manipulated by foreign luxury and ambition. Cleopatra became not merely a political rival in Roman narratives, but a symbol of dangerous seduction threatening Roman order itself. The conflict became inevitable. At the Battle of Actium, the forces of Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavian in a decisive naval confrontation. The battle ended in catastrophe. Their fleet collapsed, and with it, their hopes of resisting Rome. After the defeat, Octavian advanced toward Egypt. The end came quickly. Antony, believing Cleopatra dead, took his own life. Cleopatra, facing capture and humiliation in Rome, chose death rather than surrender. According to tradition, she died through the bite of an asp, though the exact details remain uncertain. With her death, ancient Egypt ended. Not the civilization itself, not the people, but the age of independent pharaohs that had lasted for thousands of years. Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire, valued enormously for its wealth and grain production. Roman governors replaced dynasties. Imperial authority flowed from Rome rather than the Nile. The temples still stood. The pyramids still rose above the desert. But the kingdom that built them was gone. And yet, even in defeat, Egypt's influence endured. Rome absorbed Egyptian religion, architecture, and symbolism. Obelisks were transported across the empire. The mystery and grandeur of the Nile fascinated Roman society. Cleopatra herself became legendary, remembered not only as a queen, but as the final embodiment of a civilization that had once dominated the ancient world. Her death closed one of history's longest chapters. For over 3,000 years, Egypt had survived through dynasties, invasions, collapses, and rebirths. It had built monuments beyond imagination and created a civilization whose legacy would outlive every empire that conquered it. Now, the age of the pharaohs belonged to history. But history would never forget Egypt. Chapter 14. The Lost Tombs and Buried Secrets. Long after the pharaohs disappeared, Egypt refused to let go of its mysteries. The kingdoms had fallen. Foreign empires had ruled the Nile. The temples had faded into silence beneath drifting sand. Yet across the desert, the monuments remained, watching centuries pass in absolute stillness. The pyramids still rose against the horizon. The statues still stared into eternity. And beneath the ground, secrets waited. For generations after the fall of ancient Egypt, many of its greatest structures became abandoned ruins. Sand-buried temples, tomb entrances disappeared beneath rock and dust. Ancient cities vanished entirely beneath layers of time. The civilization that once dominated the ancient world slowly transformed into legend. Travelers from Greece and Rome stared at the pyramids with awe, unable to fully explain how they had been built. Stories spread about hidden chambers, cursed tombs, forgotten treasures, and sacred knowledge locked beneath the desert. Egypt became a land of mystery. But the deeper truth was even more extraordinary. Because beneath the sands of the Nile Valley rested one of the greatest archaeological records in human history. The Egyptians had built for eternity, and eternity preserves. Unlike many ancient civilizations whose monuments collapsed completely, Egypt's dry climate protected temples, tombs, statues, inscriptions, and even bodies themselves across thousands of years. Entire worlds survived beneath the desert almost untouched. Yet for centuries, much of this history remained hidden. Many royal tombs had already been robbed in ancient times. Gold and treasure attracted thieves almost immediately after burials, especially during periods of political instability. Even the tombs of mighty pharaohs were not safe forever. The Valley of the Kings, hidden among barren cliffs west of the Nile, became one of the most important burial grounds of the new kingdom. Here, rulers abandoned giant pyramids and instead carved elaborate tombs deep into the mountains. The goal was secrecy, protection, isolation from grave robbers. But even these hidden chambers were eventually discovered by thieves. Still, what remained inside revealed astonishing details about Egyptian civilization: wall paintings, sacred texts, statues, jewelry, weapons, furniture, and mummies preserved with incredible precision. The Egyptians believed the body had to survive for the soul to continue into the afterlife. So they perfected preservation. Mummification became one of the most advanced burial practices in the ancient world. Priests carefully removed organs, treated the body with natron salts, wrapped it in linen, and sealed it within elaborately decorated coffins and tombs. Death itself became an art form. Every object buried with the dead reflected belief in eternity. Food, clothing, weapons, games, treasures, and sacred writings accompanied rulers into the afterlife as though another world awaited beyond death. And perhaps the greatest discovery of all came in the 20th century. Tutankhamun. For centuries, the young pharaoh had been largely forgotten. His reign had been brief, overshadowed by the chaos following Akhenaten's religious revolution. Compared to rulers like Ramses II or Thutmose III, Tutankhamun seemed historically insignificant. Yet his tomb changed everything. In 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter uncovered the entrance to a nearly intact royal burial chamber hidden within the Valley of the Kings. Unlike most royal tombs, which had been heavily looted, Tutankhamun's burial remained astonishingly preserved. When Carter peered inside by candlelight and was asked if he could see anything, he reportedly answered, "Yes, wonderful things." The discovery stunned the world. Gold covered nearly every surface. Chariots, statues, jewelry, weapons, ceremonial objects, and the famous golden death mask revealed a level of craftsmanship and wealth beyond imagination. It was as though ancient Egypt itself had returned from the dead. The tomb transformed global fascination with Egyptian civilization. Newspapers across the world covered every detail. Museums filled with crowds eager to witness artifacts untouched for over 3,000 years. And then came the stories. Rumors of curses spread rapidly after several individuals connected to the excavation died unexpectedly. Tales of supernatural punishment captured public imagination, turning Tutankhamun's tomb into something larger than archaeology. A legend. But beyond the myths, the discovery carried enormous historical importance. It revealed extraordinary details about royal burial practices, religion, craftsmanship, and the immense wealth concentrated around the pharaoh. It also reminded the modern world of something essential. Much of Egypt still remained buried. Even today, archaeologists continue uncovering lost tombs, hidden chambers, forgotten temples, and ancient settlements beneath the sands. New discoveries constantly reshape understanding of Egyptian history. Because Egypt was never truly silent. Its monuments speak through stone. Its tombs preserve memory. Its dead continue telling stories thousands of years after their civilization vanished. The pharaohs sought immortality, and in a way, they achieved it. Their kingdom fell. Their empire disappeared. But their names, monuments, and mysteries endured longer than almost any civilization in human history. Buried beneath the desert, ancient Egypt still waits. Chapter 15. The Eternal Legacy of Egypt. Empires rise. Empires fall. But some civilizations become something greater than power alone. They become eternal. Ancient Egypt was one of them. For more than 3,000 years, the civilization along the Nile endured through triumph and collapse, conquest and rebellion, golden ages and dark centuries. Dynasties vanished. Foreign kings claimed the throne. Empires from Persia, Greece, and Rome absorbed the land into their own dominions. Yet Egypt never disappeared completely, because its influence became larger than the kingdom itself. The Egyptians understood something few civilizations truly grasped. Power fades, but memory can survive forever. That belief shaped everything they built. The pyramids, temples, statues, and tombs were not created only for the present. They were designed to challenge time itself, to preserve names, achievements, and identity long after death. And somehow, they succeeded. Thousands of years after the first stones were placed at Giza, the pyramids still stand above the desert horizon. The temples of Karnak and Luxor continue to tower beside the Nile. Colossal statues stare across the sands with the same silent authority they carried in the age of the pharaohs. Entire empires that once conquered the world have vanished almost completely. Egypt remains visible. Its influence spread far beyond architecture. Egyptian ideas about kingship, religion, administration, engineering, and art shaped civilizations across the ancient world. Greek scholars traveled to Egypt seeking knowledge. Roman rulers filled their cities with Egyptian obelisks and symbols. Even after Egypt lost political independence, its cultural power endured. The mystery surrounding the civilization only strengthened over time. To later societies, Egypt became a symbol of hidden wisdom, ancient power, and forgotten knowledge. Its monuments seemed almost supernatural to those unable to comprehend how they had been built. And for centuries, much of its language itself was lost. Hieroglyphs covered temples and tombs, but no one could read them anymore. The voices of the pharaohs became silent, trapped within stone inscriptions no living person understood. Then came the Rosetta Stone. Discovered during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, the stone carried the same text written in multiple scripts, including Greek and hieroglyphs. It became the key that unlocked the ancient language itself. For the first time in centuries, Egypt could speak again. Names buried for thousands of years returned to history. The stories of kings, queens, battles, rituals, and beliefs emerged from temple walls and tomb inscriptions. Archaeology transformed Egypt from legend into one of the best documented civilizations of the ancient world. Yet even with all modern discoveries, Egypt continues to hold mysteries. Hidden chambers may still exist beneath the pyramids. Countless tombs remain undiscovered beneath the desert sands. Entire cities may still lie buried beneath layers of earth and time. The civilization is ancient, but not fully revealed. Perhaps that is why Egypt continues to fascinate the modern world more than almost any other ancient culture. It exists between history and myth, understood enough to amaze us, yet mysterious enough to feel timeless. The pharaohs themselves became immortal in ways they could never have imagined. Their names appear in books, documentaries, museums, films, and research across the world. Their monuments attract millions who travel across continents simply to stand before structures built thousands of years ago. Very few civilizations command that level of endurance. Egypt does, because the kingdom along the Nile achieved something extraordinary. It defeated oblivion, not through conquest alone, not through war, but through permanence. Stone outlived flesh, memory outlived empire, and the civilization that once worshipped eternity became eternal itself. The Nile still flows through the desert as it did when the first villages formed upon its banks. The sun still rises over the pyramids each morning. The sands still cover ruins waiting to be discovered. And somewhere beneath that endless desert, the ancient world still sleeps, waiting to be remembered again.